Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest. We honor creators, and today we have with us a creative person, Trent. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
And thanks, Megan, for helping me out today.
Of course. Glad to be here.
So Trent would like to discuss the dangers of dogma. And Trent, go ahead and say your disclaimer.
Sure. So I'm a non-believer, but I also am very much a proponent of consent. And I think that when we are talking about things that, if I'm sharing a story about the way my own faith was eroded and eventually abandoned, then I need to acknowledge that discussing that has the potential, at least in some small part, to do the same thing for others. And so I just want to make sure that anyone watching this who feels sensitive to that or doesn't want to accept the risk, no matter how small that involves, that they'll know that that's what we're going to be discussing. And so you have the option to listen or not with consent.
Sounds good. So Trent, what led you to start thinking this way, where you wanted to talk about dogma and the problems with dogma in general?
Well, my own life experiences in a nutshell. I started out life in a very devout LDS family, and I myself was very devout for years. Probably about age 36 is when I first started giving credence to some of my questions and doubts. And probably around age 42 is when I had finally reached a point where I could emerge from that, making some decisions about abandoning faith. And the base realization was that this mechanism that within the vernacular of the LDS Church we call the Holy Ghost or revelation, they call it other things in other religions. And there are similar paradigms in all kinds of secular domains of our society that are the same phenomenon, just under a different name. We use these mechanisms as a way of ascertaining truth or validity of things or the reality of things. But what I discovered is it's very unreliable at actually detecting or determining truth. And so when I discovered that, particularly in its relationship to Mormonism, I abandoned it because I realized that had been the component in my life that had caused tragedy after tragedy after tragedy without me recognizing it as the core and fundamental element. And I also recognized that my entire belief system was shaped kind of like an inverted pyramid, where, bottom beliefs found the next level and they found the next level and the next level. And at the very bottom of that was this sort of unreliable modality for determining truth. And so when I pulled that bottom part out, the whole structure collapsed.
And in a way, this is similar to how humans experience being conned by a con man or a con artist or something like that, where they present as honest and you feel good about how your relationship is going, and then you basically open up your bank account to them and only because you felt like they were going to be good for you. And that's the whole idea.
Yes.
They got your confidence, and then they got into your purse strings.
Yeah, I think that's a great example. And I think a more generic term that we could use to describe this phenomenon is a sort of trust for trust itself. It's not a trust that's based on experience or observation or anything like that. It's just kind of a granted trust. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes it's based on, something that's a nugget of truth or something that feels reasonable or feels true. And it's something that you keep going back to over and over again. Every time you start to doubt, you go back to that initial experience or that initial feeling that you had, and you say, but right from the very beginning, I felt this. And you use that to inform all the experiences that come after rather than the other way around.
And we can be born into a situation, right?
Right.
I've told lots of people will say that I value as very good people who happen to be LDS or Mormon. And I say, if you were born in India, you would probably be a really good Hindu. just to help them think.
Yeah, and I mean, you can see how this this phenomenon, and we kind of just mimetically hand it down, just like you just said, Gene. But you can see how this would have evolved with some pragmatism in our deep history, 100,000 years ago more, where we lived in such profound scarcity. We had to come up with ways of making ourselves feel at peace with both a world that we could not control and that seemed savage to us, and with having to mistreat and dehumanize other human beings in order to get what we needed and still feel comfortable with ourselves, right?
Enemy
And
tribes.
see how this kind of a phenomenon, this sort of paradigm would facilitate that just naturally. And it could even evolve without conscious thinking about the ramifications of it. But now we live in a world where for the first time in the history of our species, we kind of have a toehold on scarcity, but we're still mimetically handing this practice down without thought, even though we now have the luxury of kind of thinking about it and saying, do we still need to behave in this way? Is this still an advantage to us? Is it still helping? Which is new. And I think it's why it's so deeply terrifying to us to contemplate, is that it's been just an inherent part of us for so many thousands of years.
Yeah, you touched on an interesting point about making us feel better about needing to mistreat other people. And I think by the same token, it's also a way of explaining past behavior, or at least coming to terms with past behavior, excusing past behavior in the name of a belief system, rather than just saying our ancestors were terrible people.
Yeah. And, you can still have some grace for that. It was a world where you died if you didn't do that, right? That's a pretty harsh set of choices there,
Right.
But it's also important to recognize that it's probably not serving us very well anymore.
Right.
Like if the leader said, don't eat those berries, or don't travel too far away from our tribe or our group. If you didn't follow the leader, then you didn't pass your genes along.
Right.
Right. Right. And in tribalism, differentiation was death. It was literal death. And now we're in a situation where we can differentiate and we can individuate and still survive.
Yeah.
And so these are great questions that you're asking. Do we still need that other set of rules to live by when we're in a situation where we can provide for ourselves better?
Right. It's not so much a zero-sum pie anymore. Like you could imagine, some ancient tribe, they've failed in their hunt for, a week. They're realizing they're in danger. Another tribe, a neighboring tribe, has food. Well, we're the chosen tribe. We're the one that's favored by Hooga Booga or whoever. So that means we're entitled to go take that because we're the destined tribe. You can see how that would give you a sense of both justification and alleviate any feelings of conscience that you might have for the suffering that's going to be caused by you taking something from someone else, assuming you succeeded. But we don't have that zero-sum pie anymore, even though we act like it. There's way more resource than we need to satisfy basic needs for the entire population of the world.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the most troubling parts of religious narrative is the quote unquote chosen people narrative, because then people have this mindset where everything that they do is really for the greater good. And it's really because other people don't know that they're not living the chosen way. But I do know I am living the chosen way. And so if I do something that maybe forces someone else to live the same way that I do, it's really for their good in the long run.
The ends justify the means. And the same thing happens politically, like American exceptionalism or British kingdom. What is it? The sun never sets on the British Empire.
The colonialism.
Colonialism.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I was interested to ask you, as you're thinking through these different ideas, what solutions are coming to mind for how we might better expand our ideology to include some of these ideas? You know, if we are believers, how do we dip that first toe into accepting some of the ideas you're talking about?
There are a couple of things. That's probably the most important question to this, because when you're talking about a transitional period like the one that I think we're in, that's the real question: is what can we do to make this transition effectively, rather than it just being a subconscious thing that takes 200 years to unfold, right? One of the things that I feel very strongly about is that we need to change the way we rear our young. And it's actually not a very difficult change. It's just changing one thing. We're all born kind of like a fish into an ocean of tradition. And we just start breathing it the moment we're born. We're not even aware it's there. You know, it's like air. We don't care about it unless it's all of a sudden a big storm or something stinks, right? It's invisible. But we could be intentional as parents about, instead of handing down things to insulate our children into a particular ideology and to make everything outside it a taboo, to do the opposite of that, to say, this is the very best we've been able to come up with, but you have the privilege and the obligation to bang on this as hard as you can, to test it, to adjust it, to throw out the parts that are no longer a relevant modality.
Be curious.
Yeah, you have the right and the obligation, and we're going to celebrate that because we want to improve it, right? That one small change, I think, would have a dramatic impact in just a few generations. The other one is not as easy, that I think about a lot. At least I haven't been able to think of a way to make it easy. I think there's 4 basic realities that as human beings we have traditionally feared. There's death, there's isolation or being alone, there's powerlessness, and there's meaninglessness.
Well, there's 5, and then there's taxes.
And taxes. But those are actually, and it scares a lot of people even just to say this to them, but those are actually the ground state of humanity. As a lone human, so if you drop me on a desert isle, that's what it means to be human. I'm alone. I'm going to die, whether I want to or not. Maybe not immediately, but I will. There's no meaning unless I bring it. And there's no power unless I do something to change that, right? The social things that we build are really good at mitigating 2 of those. But again, we basically have all these religions and things that, instead of teaching our children to build on those realities, to accept and build on those realities, to make them friends, so to speak, which I know sounds weird, but they really are our friends if we face them. We build mythologies for the express purpose of skirting them or ignoring them or denying them. And inevitably what happens is that fails us when realities that we have no control over come knocking. And those are the things that we need to start building our belief systems on, not building belief systems to escape those, right? But that's a big ask, especially for someone who's already indoctrinated with something to fear and escape them. Does that make sense?
Right. Totally makes sense. And I love what you were saying, your first point, because my entire podcast is about making one small change that becomes revolutionary. It's why I named it the Midlife Revolution, because it's not an age. It's a time in your life where you start questioning everything that was handed to you. And so what you're saying is exactly what I talk about on my podcast all the time. And I wish, if I have one regret, and I think I really do only have one, it's that I didn't break through these generational barriers sooner so that I could have been a better parent to my kids. Because as a young mom, I parented the way I was parented until I started to realize that's not really the way to form a connection with your child. It was controlling. It was the way that my parents parented me. But I came to realize far too late, because my youngest daughter is 15 and a half. And almost all my other kids are grown and gone. But I came to realize that the highest and best form of parenting is parenting as guide, parent as guardian. yes, I'm going to keep you safe as much as I possibly can, but I'm not going to just hand you things as the absolute truth. I'm going to allow you to discover the world that's out there and choose for yourself what are the things that resonate with you, and what kind of human do you want to be, and how do you want to show up in the world, and how do you want to make your life, what do you want to make it look like. So I think we can educate, we can teach, but we also teach that we're not the arbiter of all the knowledge, and we're not the one that knows all the things. There's so much I don't know. Please go out and find it. Let me give you roots and wings. And I wish that I had thought about that sooner as a parent. So I love what you're saying about that.
And you can see how that propensity to hermetically seal our children into what we inherited, it came from that desperate idea that this has allowed us to survive in this horrible, bitter world. We got to keep this going. It just naturally came from it. So we're really at a new crossroads in the whole history of humanity, where this is the first time we have the luxury of bucking that, or even noticing that it's something we can change.
And I think that when Megan has given herself permission for her personal empowerment, that's when the greatest growth can be. And so when we can realize that it's basically the power of individualism, where instead of following the leader, if the whole group improves themselves and each other, society can grow faster, maybe because we can share information faster than ever, and we can take back our sovereignty, like Megan was saying. Everything as we're growing is an input from the outside, and we're not able to express ourselves until we're 40 or something like that. And if we could do that earlier, it opens up a whole new world for the future, I think.
Yeah, I think Brene Brown said that you can't be a good mother until you stop being an obedient daughter. And I think that applies to all of us in some situation in our lives. And even if it's not parenthood, even if it is just letting go of all of the ideas that were put into our head and embracing the new ideas that maybe are different.
And interestingly, even within dogmatic structures, like I remember a woman giving a talk in General Conference, and she talked about how when the family prepares canned ham, they cut off each side of the ham. And that's just what the family did because mom did that. And then they realized after asking, she said, well, my pot was only so big and the canned ham was bigger. So I had to cut off the ends to fit it in the pan. And they were doing this thing just because mom did it, right? It was just a tradition without thinking what it was. And here we have a great example of examining things, thinking about them critically, discussing whether that's what should be instead of just unquestionably doing it, being given at a general conference, meeting without the real lesson of, hey, everybody, think critically, being the thing that we should learn from it.
Sometimes I have this thought, and this is conjecture, but you think about, like, there's around almost 9 billion people on the planet now.
8.2.
And how many of those people, through this mechanism of hermetically sealing them into a tradition, have had their potential sort of collapsed into a little point singularity that never gets any attention or expression? And how much potential would that have if we could unleash it to overcome the fear that causes us to force our children into that hermetically sealed? It kind of feels like to me there would be a tipping point if we could just see that all that potential, or even just 20% of it expressed, and see what it actually does to the human family. Would it be enough to tip us past the fear of facing those four realities and of stopping this hermetic sealing that we do to our children?
That's right.
But again, the question is, how do we get to that? How do we? What's the catalyst that we get to that point with?
Yeah. we're trained to be cogs in a wheel or a machine instead of trained to help redesign the machine so it works better.
I was going to say we're even conditioned to venerate and see it as a virtue, that we're just a log on the fire to warm someone's backside, and that's the sum of our life. We're content. We're conditioned to be content with it, which is just a tragedy. It's billions of lives just not fructifying into their even a fraction of their potential.
And Trent and I are speaking from a privileged male position where women are even more trained to be subservient to men as a condition of their existence.
Right. My highest calling was to produce offspring and to support my husband in whatever his calling was. But I naturally had to overcome that very early because, I married somebody who wasn't a Mormon, and then he did join the church, but he wasn't in for very long. And so I, by default, had to take the reins of spiritual guidance for my children. And also, had to provide financially because he was chronically underemployed. And so I think that helped me to break out of the dogma sooner, because I really was in this position where I had developed these skills and leadership and abilities and all of this, but there wasn't any place for it in the Mormon world. So, but to your point, speaking from my own experience, Mormonism is a really safe place. The more answers a religion provides, the safer you feel, and the more you feel insulated from those existential fears that you mentioned. And it is scary to think about having to come up with those answers on your own. And it can be scary to contemplate being stuck in the space of, I have no idea, when your entire life you knew everything. You knew for a surety, you didn't doubt it, and stepping into that unknown is very scary for a lot of people. And so you ask the question, how do we break out of it? And I think it's just by taking that first courageous step outside of the bubble that you were handed or that you were sealed into, and just daring to imagine that your life could look different than you thought it would.
I think that thinking whether ignorance is bliss is where you want to be, or knowledge is power. What camp? Ignorance or knowledge? And once you choose knowledge, you can start working on the situation.
Yeah, I have kind of held out hope. Like sometimes you wonder if things you observe are just you fulfilling your own desires, But I have noticed here in Utah, specifically, because that's where I live and that's where I have daily observation. But it feels like there's an impetus that's gathering because, like, for example, when I was a child, if someone were to have left the church in the community I grew up in, not only would they be ostracized, but it would have been really easy for them to be cast as either a villain or a tragedy. And everyone would have bought it, right? But now we have in Utah, we're kind of again reaching a tipping point where there's enough people who have left or even sort of given the bird to the church, and they're not getting crushed by God's thumb. They're not sick. They're not, they're actually happy people who are having meaningful lives. And so people who are in the church have that to observe. And so when these questions come along, they have fewer of those scenarios where it's either the villain or the tragedy. They have scenarios where they see, oh, someone's actually successful and happy. And I actually had my very first faith crisis. It took a whole bunch of them for me. That's how bad it was. But in Finland, because I was there on a mission, and here I was in this country that was completely secular. I mean, they all say they're Lutherans, but it's a secular country. That's just, it's kind of just a social Lutheranism.
We don't believe in anything, but if you do believe in Lutheranism. Yeah.
I mean, and it's just a context for the way they gather and have traditions and stuff more than it is a belief system. But super happy people, a thriving advanced, technologically advanced group of people. There were things there back in the 90s that I didn't see here until the 2010s. And it was so palpable that it undermined my faith, because I had always been taught, if you deviate from this, it's either the tragedy or the villain,
The lone and dreary world.
Yeah. And there
and
it was, right?
All these atheist Lutherans were being blessed by God.
Or just because they were doing the right thing.
Right.
But yeah, so I'm kind of hoping that that's not just me sort of carrying out a confirmation bias that's tied to my own hopes of things changing, and that it's an actual trend. But it seems like a reasonable thing that the more we have people coming out of these paradigms, and the more it shows, then the more comfortable and the less scared people will be to take steps out of those paradigms and into something where they're a little more free.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And I'm grateful that there are so many examples of people out there who have left the faith and are thriving and happy. I know there are people who have left and are not that. And I know there are people who have left and have had significant tragedies and difficulties. I'm grateful that I'm not one of those, but I think part of it came from this idea of not accepting what they say about me because I've left the church. We get that old trope of the angry ex-Mormon, and we get the trope of, you just left because you wanted to sin. And I think that for me, establishing a really strong foundation of who I actually am and what I actually do believe in and what I value, that was the most important thing for me to do when I left the church. What do I believe? What do I value? And reminding myself of the positive qualities that I have that have not changed, because leaving the church did not change me. I still believe in personal integrity. I still believe in helping humanity. I still believe in being someone who creates more than I destroy. Those values have not changed, but the way that I practice those values has changed. And I think it's changed for the better. It's freed me to do so many more things and to be so much more effective in my work, in my life, in my service to others than I ever could have been in the church.
And you're not trying to behave like that in order to get a bigger house in heaven. Right. I don't have this extrinsic motivation that the only reason I'm going to help flood victims in Kerrville is so that God will see me doing it and reward me accordingly. I'm doing it because I care about alleviating suffering in other human beings. That motivation for almost everything I do hasn't changed, because I don't think I ever did do it so that God would see me, but there was always that expectation of like, I'm doing good because I know that God would want me to do this. I always cared about the individual, but removing God from the equation for me reaffirmed to me that that's who I am at my core, without anybody telling me to be that way. One thing I realized that when I thought I prayed and I thought that I was receiving an answer from a deity, it was really just myself. And so there is a value for like meditation and mindfulness and trying to use the resources you have available to solve problems, and realizing that our brains are amazing. We can figure things out. We can do hard things. That was sort of empowering, to feel that way. To gain my own personal sovereignty was a way of advancing, growing.
Yeah, Trent, you mentioned just before we started here sharing some of your own experiences, and I always love to hear people's stories. So I'd love for you to share some of your own experiences with us.
Well, I'll share one that is simpler than some of the others. This actually wasn't the one that got me over that was the catalyst that got me over the energy barrier, but it was the second to the last one. Shortly after my mission, and I came home early from my mission because I had a faith crisis on my mission, which I I did a lot of backflips to restore my faith. But I was in a vulnerable state because in a lot of LDS communities, especially at that time, coming home early from a mission, regardless of the reason, diminishes your status in the culture and sort of puts a scarlet letter on you. And I had a stake president that reinforced the Bensonian and Kimball mandates of marry quick, marry immediately, don't put too much thought into who you're marrying. It doesn't matter as long as it's in the covenant. Have as many kids as quick as you can. Don't put it off for anything. Do school and work and all this stuff all simultaneously. So he reinforced that for me. So I went through all of the canonical literature I could find and compiled a photocopy of all those talks and scriptures and things. And that became my blueprint for what I was going to do to find a spouse, get married, have a family, and so forth. Wow. And so that was the vulnerable space that I was in when this occurred. And the girl that I started dating at that time, who became my first wife, she was living with a family who was kind of unofficially fostering her because she was also in a vulnerable state from a family that had fallen apart. And the family that was fostering her had come from out of state because one of their children had been abused by a neighbor, and the legal system failed them. And so he was right in their neighborhood still, and they just couldn't justify the risk of staying there with their children. So they ended up moving into our ward. Well, this was the 90s, and it was the time of the satanic panic, that was really rampant in Utah Valley. And they went to their bishop to kind of ask for advice, what to do for their child. And the bishop had a list of recommended therapists, and he happened to give them the name of one who's notorious. And I guess I won't say their name just because I don't want any legal entanglements for Gene, but they're notorious for this. This is a pattern with them. They were using memory retrieval techniques that have since been discredited, but they trusted the bishop, and they sent their child to this therapist. And soon it went from the child's own recollection and discussion about what had happened to her into retrieved memories that turned it into ritual abuse. And then it turned into her, remembering that multiple children in their family had been involved in this ritual abuse. And then it turned into, it's going on here in Utah too, because it's a whole cabal. It's a whole nationwide secret community of ritual abuse that's going on. And so at this point, the parents were overwhelmed. So they go back to the bishop, of course, because bishops can solve any problem. They know everything and can do everything because they've been called. And, through what the bishop felt was the Holy Ghost and his mantle and his authority in that position, he confirmed to the parents that, yes, the Holy Ghost is telling me that all of this is correct. The therapist has identified this cabal, and it is correct. And not only that, but the Holy Ghost is telling me I have a role to play in this ward to root out what part of it is intersecting with our ward and to protect the families and children in this ward. So a witch hunt started, and it was just literally a witch hunt. He started, praying over names and asking the different children in their family after they'd go to the therapist who they were seeing in these memories. And then he'd bring those people in and interview them. And eventually, of course, because my fiance was living in that house, and so I was dating her and everything, the bishop eventually called me into the office and said, I know this is going to sound strange and out of the blue, but you have been abused by this satanic cult for years and years and years. And they have special, powers that they can use to program people and compartmentalize their brains and keep this all separate. So you don't even know that this has been going on. So,
and was that part of the reason? Was that part of the reason that you came home early from your mission, because this underlying abuse in your life? Maybe was he thinking that?
No, that was never actually tied together, but that surprises me that it wasn't. That would have been pretty typical for what was going on. I watched how in my own mind, and I watched a lot of other people, because this ended up basically ripping the whole town apart, because the stake president later got involved, and he bought into it through the spirit and all that. Families split up over it. People were reporting family members to DCFS and to the police with nothing more than a spiritual feeling and a confirmation from a bishop. People were being told they couldn't come to church, couldn't be in the primary anymore, all these things were just tearing the community apart. There were people who lost jobs. I accused my own parents of having been ritual abusers, which took decades for me to repair that relationship. I didn't allow them to come to my wedding when I married my wife. And the key to all of it was this idea that we can trust this mechanism that flags something as either true or false without any fallibility, and that we can trust that that's the mechanism that put our leaders in their positions, and we can trust that those leaders are using that mechanism, and so they're making the right decisions. And after this went on, the witch hunt went on for about a year, people started just bombarding church headquarters in Salt Lake with complaints about this bishop and stake president. And so the church sent Russell Ballard down to the stake, and he went into each ward individually and stood at the pulpit. But he just made generalities about, we don't focus on evil, we focus on good, and we focus on the light of Christ and the example of Christ. And the really interesting thing was the stake president kind of got the message, and he sort of let go of it, but they kept him in his calling. They kept him in his position. The bishop of the ward, he turned the whole thing upside down through the spirit. And he believed that Elder Ballard had confirmed everything he was doing and confirmed this mission that he had taken on. And that the reason why they released him was so that he could do it in a more,
devote more time to it.
Yeah, he could dedicate himself to it more fully. And tragically, their family, the bishop's family, ended up moving north, and he was called as a patriarch. And I'm sure that reaped all kinds of havoc in the stake that they moved into. But that was the first time when I recognized, and again, I did backflips to make it work again, but it was the first time I recognized that it's that little kernel of trust for that mechanism that allegedly is never wrong. It always tells you true or false, right? That's the problem. That is the very bottom of that pointed pyramid that's upside down. And that's the thing that lets us so readily rework the whole universe and make a fantasy a reality, or believe that it's okay for us to dehumanize someone or whatever. It's a danger. It's a real danger.
It is incredibly dangerous. And I can say that almost universally, the story that you're telling is just so horrific, but it always starts in the same place. I've been given a special mission by God. God called me to do this special thing. Almost universally. And it's not just in the scenario you're talking about, but we saw it obviously in the Daybell case. I saw it in other cult leaders that I talked to in the Utah and Idaho area. All of these little groups that have splintered off from the church that sort of take their root in Mormonism, but they believe that God called them to do something just slightly different. And then they form their own little band of followers, and they start their own thing based on what? Based on an idea that came to them that they attributed to God. And it's always the same thing. They believe they have a special mission or a special power or a special something that was given to them by God. And it's incredibly dangerous, as you're saying.
Yeah, it is. It's super dangerous. And it doesn't often get characterized as a danger. And when it does, it often gets kind of poo-pooed by saying, well, but look at all the good. Look at all the good it's done. But the question I eventually had to ask myself was, is that good exclusive to it, or can I have that good without it? Do I need it for the good? And the answer that I came up with is no, I don't. I can't think of a single real good that I value that I need that for. So all it's bringing to the table is that risk of justifying something without a justification, or making something a virtue that's actually very horrific, or fooling myself into thinking that something fictional is real, or that something real is unreal, however that unfolds. And I can't personally justify it. I can't justify the risk. I haven't seen a justification for it yet.
Right. We think, the Salem witch trials, those were rubes, and, people from hundreds of years ago that aren't as sophisticated would do something like that. And you observed a modern day reliving of almost the exact same thing.
Yeah. Again, it's not stupid, evil, malevolent people. It's not insanity. A whole community doesn't go insane simultaneously. It's that little kernel that we use to justify. That's what it is. And it's dangerous. We don't have to do it, but we do. And we've been doing it for millions. Well, I guess millions,
Yeah.
But humans themselves, Homo sapiens, probably for about 300,000 years, we've been doing it.
Right.
As a way to survive. And it's only just now that we have the luxury of saying, is this working? Is this a good thing? Does it even give us that mean advantage that it gave us during times of horrific scarcity? Or do we not even get that from it anymore?
Right. We could say that at least nobody was burned at the stake center. But
it could have gone that way.
There was a lot of damage.
It was getting weird enough that I could have seen people justifying.
But there was carnage, family carnage, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Happened.
The cost was extremely high. There's people who are still suffering from that one incident.
Yeah. And I love the point that you made of, look at the good. Well, can I get the good without that? And you're absolutely right. You don't need the power of discernment to know who is suffering in the world and how you can alleviate that suffering. And frankly, I think that it would be interesting to try and quantify, although I know it's not realistically possible, but to try and quantify the good versus the bad that the churches and the religions, and not just the LDS Church, but all the churches, all the Christian denominations, all the Islamic, all of the Jewish, because every religion has caused human suffering in the name of their religion. And can we look at it and say, has it done more harm than good? And I think the answer probably would be yes, if we really did try to quantify it. How many lives has that religion destroyed as opposed to lives that they've made better?
I agree. I tend to agree with that a lot. And so part of my exodus from faith belief, I went from like Mormonism to Christianity to religion in general to spirituality. And then I realized it's an even bigger envelope than that, because in academia, in the corporate world, in the entertainment world, in media, in almost everything, there's an analog of it.
Yeah.
And the same question applies. And as I sat and ruminated in that question and really looked, I was trying to steel man a justification that of some good that it exclusively brings. It doesn't. I still haven't been able to find one. Maybe someone could come up with one. I don't know.
So I
haven't been able to.
I relate that thought to a situation. The Jif Peanut Butter Corporation had some of their products cause sickness in about 20 people. And so you figure if 20 people reported, maybe hundreds were really affected by the problem. And they recalled $120 million worth of product just to ensure that their name would be thought of as a safeguard for nutrition and bodily intake of foods, right? And yet some poor person who's misguidedly told that they're worthless because of the way they are might commit suicide, and people just think, well, who cares? Other people can be damaged mentally and have to go through years and years of therapy and just say, well, it's too bad that they didn't pray enough or didn't read their scriptures enough so that they didn't need to be helped in that way. So anyway, that to me is an example of what a corporation does in our current civilization to be held accountable, and what are these other institutions doing to be held accountable? Almost nothing. And you contrast that with the what was that story? They called it the AP Arizona revelation that the church was covering up, not generational, but multiple children's abuse from a church member, and they weren't going to allow the bishop to testify, and they were basically trying to sweep a problem under the rug instead of, taking responsibility for it.
Yeah, and that's one of the ways that you can identify healthy people, healthy institutions, is do they take responsibility for their mistakes, and how do they respond when there's demonstrable proof that they've been a bad actor.
And do they use the word apology?
Well, and I've been saying a lot of, we can extend grace here, we can extend grace there, but I also want to say this. So in the course of my crazy life and the personal events that ripped me out of belief, I had several years of direct dialogue and meetings with a member of the Quorum of the 12 who's still seated. And I realized something that I couldn't believe I had never thought of before. But when imagine yourself, as a member of the Quorum of the 12, you're sitting in your office, your communications every day are going to be bombarded with what? Faithful members saying, my son has bone cancer. Can you please heal them like Jesus did? I just lost my job because I lost my sight. Can you please heal my eyes? My father's dying, and his dying wish is just to know, to see you come here and tell him in person. I mean, they are inundated in the tragedy, right? You can't receive that kind of stuff every day and not be aware of the fact that you don't have that power, that you can't. Now maybe there's all kinds of ways you can justify in your head using faith, using the little kernel to make it okay, but you can't deny that you can't raise your hand to the square and make a leg regrow or a kid heal from bone cancer or anything like that. You know it for sure, right? You also can't sit there every day without seeing the ledgers of the church, because you're on the committee that oversees the sacred funds of the church. So you know that however many billions of dollars or hundreds of billions of dollars are sitting in the church coffers, and you know how it's divided up and where it's put and how that's being organized and set up, even if only through underlings that are telling you. So regardless of how they justify that or make it right with their faith, there's culpability there because there's an understanding and a knowledge of exactly what the workings of that are and the way it operates. That's different from a standard member of the church who doesn't have that knowledge. Does that make any sense?
I think
So
in
there's
the
a culpability when those guys stand at the pulpit and say things, especially within that context.
We know
and
that
they
in
should be held accountable for that.
Right. We know that in the automobile industry, there have been times where there's a defective part and they don't recall because they know that their claims against them for the defective part won't damage the amount of profit they might make enough to say, okay, we have to change. So totally financial decision. And because of those lawsuits and everything, there's in the punitive angle, they have to be better. They're willing now to recall almost everything. A seat belt buckle bolt wasn't properly installed or something like that. They're willing to do recalls now because of those prior lawsuits. And so there must be something where the church, in a way, without being subject to any laws and any lawsuits like that, they're given free rein to do whatever they want, just about, that they're thinking, maybe we don't have to recall anything. Maybe we don't have to change too much, because as long as what we're doing is increasing tithing, then we're okay. And so until the churches are within the legal system like other entities are, they will make those decisions not in the best interest of the community, but in the organization.
Yeah, but also, Trent, what you were talking about calls to mind David Bednar saying, pushing this new story of, do you have the faith not to be healed? And I wonder if his own cognitive dissonance over knowing he doesn't have the power to heal anyone has caused him to start pushing that narrative. And if you listen to some of the things that he's talked about over the last few years, he is gradually and incrementally changing the language within the church. It's the faith not to be healed. It's not the temple anymore. It's the house of the Lord. It's don't say the atonement. It's the atonement of Jesus Christ. He's gradually changing the language. And I think he's preparing for when he's going to lead the church, because by all indications, that's going to happen very soon for a long time.
Yeah.
And
I think that's a reasonable conjecture. Totally. Totally. And there was one other little point I wanted to bring up. So we see these cover-ups of abuse in the church. And we also see the church being unwilling to come out in cases like Chad and Lori Daybell and just denounce, right? And sometimes they don't even excommunicate people when they do those things.
right.
And to me, again, so this is admittedly sort of a conjecture, but I think it's very reasonable. I think the church knows that it has a dilemma, because if I say, well, no, Lori Daybell is out in left field. She is not receiving revelations from God, right? The very next question that comes into any mind that is pondering this idea is, well, why not? What's the difference between her revelation and David Bednar's revelation? What distinguishes them? And then what does the church say, right? Or if we have a bishop, a duly called bishop, right? A worthy priesthood holder, who for the 5 years he's in the office abuses children. What is the church going to say about that? That undermines revelation. It undermines the revelation that should have come to the people who called that person. It undermines the revelation that should have come to the people above them, who you would ostensibly think God would want to protect those children. He would give the revelation to the people above them. Something's not right here, right? Or to the parents, right? So
or
the
never
church
would have called him as a bishop in the first place.
Right. So the church has some inkling that there's a risk there, and they're intentionally trying to mitigate that risk, which again, that implies culpability and intentional action. That's not just a mistake. So there's accountability there. And I agree with you, Gene, that shouldn't be protected by some kind of special social veneration or skirting of the law because it's a religion. That's every bit as much damaging to people as when people outside religion do it, and it should be held accountable. It really should.
That's right. And this show is about how dogma creates what I say in the title, sort of like a dog whistle that creates a danger. It's a dangerous system, dangerous situation when these beliefs that are just based on a feeling instead of rational thought can lead to irrational decision-making, irrational relations with people. It can cause problems. And we just hope that, as, humanity is evolving and growing, that we can do less dogma. Do dogma no harm. Whatever. I was trying to think of something like, the medicine, oath, the Hippocratic oath. Do thy dogma no harm. So anyhow, it's fun to believe in things. I also tell people like, why don't you believe in Zeus? Like, I only don't believe in Zeus because I've been told all my life that Zeus was a myth. Well, then why do I believe anything else? Because we're not told that those things are myths culturally.
Yeah, if we at least can get beyond the idea of literal belief and think of myths as useful stories, as education, as learning tools. Because I was brought up reading Aesop's fables and found some value in the teaching there, but never once thought that there was a literal rabbit and a literal turtle out there having a race with each other. But the harm for me came when I was taught that there were some things that were literally true and that I needed to literally believe in them, because that's always going to come back to bite you at some point. And to your point earlier, Trent, one of the things I think is so tragic about dogmatic belief is the life that is lived smaller than it could have been. Without those restrictions on it, what could those people have become, and how might they have spent their short time on this rock, and what good might they have done, and what wonderful things they might have discovered. That's what's the tragedy to me.
Wow, that's a good summation. So thanks, Trent, for coming on our show. We hope to have you back for some other topics that we can consider. And thanks, Megan, for joining me. And I guess unless there's one last final word from either Trent or Megan.
Well, I just want to say thank you. This was delightful. You're wonderful people, and it was just a real pleasure to chat with you. And I also have a hopeful note to offer, maybe, that I think the better angels of human nature have been winning out very gradually over the course of human history. And I think we're at a crossroads where, even though it's mostly unconscious at the moment, we're noticing that we don't have the scarcity anymore, and these things don't really feel right anymore. The only question is, how deliberate can we be about it? How can we put that catalyst into the reaction to make it happen before we waste a whole bunch more of that human life? But I don't think these genies are going back in the bottle. I think we're moving in the right direction, and it's going to keep happening just because of the nature of our new environment and the way we adapt. So hopefully that can bring a little bit of peace and hope for the long term.
That's right. I have faith in humanity.
That is a hopeful thought.
Homo sapien has been improving for the last couple 100,000 years, and I just see the trajectory still going. There's going to be hiccups. There's going to be backslides, but overall, we've been improving.
I agree.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. Like, share, and subscribe. Do all the things, and have a great rest of 2025. All right. Bye-bye.